Welcome to all of you who are assembled on this Sunday morning with so many competing events at BIC and across the city. I think it's appropriate that the background to this copy of the book that has now been published in India is fissured, because we are really going to talk about a very fissured city. But this is the new cover, and I will leave Carol, who is a social anthropologist and honorary visiting professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, to introduce the book, and then I will take over to introduce the rest of the panel as well. She is heading the Urban and Mobility Studies program at NIAS, and her latest publication is, of course, a book she has co-edited with Vinay Gidwani and Michael Goldman, both of whom have done work on cities previously. This has come out from the University of Minnesota Press in 2024 and now in India via the Yoda Press in 2025. So may I request Carol to come up? Actually, what I might do is just introduce everybody and have you all come up to the podium. Swati Shivanand, let me start by being a little autobiographical. Say she was one of our star students at JNU and was supervised by me. She is today an interdisciplinary historian whose work spans urban, gender, labor, development, and regional studies. She is currently assistant professor at the Department of Liberal Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences in the Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Bengaluru. We have also with us today Usha Rao, who is an anthropologist and independent media maker. Her feature-length documentary called Our Metropolis was co-directed with Gautam Sonti, and that actually traces the making of Bangalore as a world-class city, and it has been screened at festivals across India and in other countries as well. And finally, we also have Bhargavi Rao. The all-woman panel was not intended, I think, but it's a very great pleasure to see that it is an all-woman panel. Bhargavi Rao works is at the intersection of community action, law, policy, and practice. As you all know, she was famously associated with the Environmental Support Group and has 25 years of experience in social and environmental justice. I was just speaking to her, and she told me that she is still battling some of the important cases that are underway in our High Court, and her work connects climate change, livelihoods, local governments through research, advocacy, and experiential learning. So may I request Carol, Swati, Usha, and Bhargavi to come up and join me here.
Good morning, and thanks to everyone for coming for this book event. As Janaki said, this book was actually published a year ago by University of Minnesota Press in the US. So we didn't do much publicity in Bangalore until now. The Yoda Press edition has come because I figured that the foreign edition was too expensive, mostly for people to buy. So now we are trying to publicize the book a bit more, and this is the first such event in Bangalore around the book. So the book is, Janaki, I think, mentioned, is an outcome of a research project that we carried out at NIAS in collaboration with my colleagues at the University of Minnesota and also UCLA. The project was titled Speculative Urbanism, Land, Labor, and Finance Capital. And it was a comparative study, actually, of two cities in Asia, Bangalore and Jakarta. And in both the projects, we were looking at the entanglements of finance, rural land, urban real estate, labor, and changing livelihoods, with the idea that very similar processes are seen across many cities in the world. The aim of the study was really to try to capture and understand the very rapid transformations we have seen in Bangalore's urban landscapes, especially since the 1990s, a lot of which was, of course, stimulated by the fact that the city became a keynote of the global IT industry. And most of you in this room would have already witnessed this transformation with the appearance of large real estate projects, especially catering to the requirements of IT companies for high-end campuses, as well as the demand for housing from the burgeoning middle class and elites. So this was the time when we began to see very large-scale, large high-rise apartment complexes coming up around the city, which completely have transformed ways of living and working. I don't need to dwell on this. Everyone knows the very rapid spatial as well as population expansion of the city, from 3 million population in 1981 to an estimated 14 million today. More than population growth, what is really important is the spatial expansion of the city, which you can see in these images. As the city pushes outward into surrounding rural areas, swallowing up villages and their agricultural lands and commons. This is one of the phenomena that we really wanted to try to map and understand through our study. So there's no need to dwell on the many urban problems that we all know about, we all discuss and moan about all the time, from deteriorating environment, traffic chaos, dwindling water resources, coupled with periodic flooding, and so on. These are some of the issues that we did address in the project, but not in the way that is usually done, more from the ground up, trying to understand how local communities, especially working class settlements and rural villages, have been coping with these kinds of changes. So as the research design of the project, basically we selected two sites for long-term and in-depth ethnographic research. One was a core city area and the other a peri-urban site where land was undergoing a process of transformation. Both the sites were selected because they were sites where very large real estate projects had just been built or were being built. The central site is actually in Yeshwanthpur, and as you know, that's a part of the city that has been drastically transformed, especially because of the closure of both public and private sector industries, which freed up land for real estate development. And so in that site, we studied the impact of these developments on a few working class neighborhoods, as well as informal settlements or slums. In the peri-urban site, we traced the networks through which land is purchased and consolidated by land aggregators and real estate developers, and also studied the consequences of urbanization for the lives and livelihoods of village residents. In both the sites, we also explored the roles of local elites, politicians, and other key actors in facilitating these transformations, as well as the contestations, of course, that always arise around them. So the project has produced several academic publications, but the aim of this book really is to bring insights from our research to a wider public. We describe this volume as a collaborative ethnography. Most of the 22 short essays collected in the book were written by members of the research team, drawing on stories and narratives from our fieldwork, and there's also a couple of invited or several invited chapters. So the chapters together, we hope, provide a picture or a narration of the lives of ordinary people grappling with this very rapid transformation. And the essays, through kind of everyday life, illuminate the complex entanglements of finance capital, real estate markets, livelihood struggles, and fraying ecologies in urban and peri-urban Bangalore. Apart from the essays, the book includes a very nice photo essay by Pierre Hauser, who is a photographer who worked with us on the project. In the introduction, we provide a brief overview of the urban development of Bangalore. And to lay out the context, we also outline the key ideas that we are trying to get across through these stories in the book. The introduction discusses the processes that are transforming cities in India and the global south, world-class city-making projects, financialization, land grabbing, infrastructure privatization, and so on, and argue that what's been happening in Bangalore is paradigmatic of these larger changes. In the introduction, we also try to unpack the central concept that ties the book together, the concept of speculative urbanism, and argue that it provides a kind of conceptual hinge through which to understand these very wide-ranging changes that we see in land, labor, capital, and ecology across many southern cities. The northern, I'm not going to go into detail on this. We could have a discussion later if you like. But basically, the idea of speculative urbanism draws on the very large literature that has emerged on global financialization, and especially assetization of land and real estate as key processes through which the financialized economy is being built. And a key dimension of assetization that's always flagged in the literature is the growing importance of rent as a source of surplus value. And that is something which we will come back to, I think, in some of the discussion today. So there have been many studies, especially in the context of the West or the global North, about the destabilizing effects of the increasing circulation of finance capital through markets. And I was just thinking in the morning that the housing crisis in New York City, which actually has been driven by private equity capital buying up distressed assets and basically making housing out of reach, is one of the major factors behind Mamdani's recent victory in the mayoral election. So we can see the kind of turbulence that is caused by this kind of financialization, especially when it comes to property and housing markets. So in the book, we do try to frame the kind of very local level processes that we talk about within this larger context of speculative urbanism and financialization of land and real estate. But we do focus on individual stories and specific sites as a way of inquiring into what really is the impact of these kind of changes for ordinary people, for everyday life. In the introduction, we also outline 6 key features of speculative urbanism, and those are the themes around which we organize the essays. The first part is called Speculative Stories. 2 chapters in this section present narratives of key, what we call movers and shakers of the city, the architects, the real estate developers, their imagination of what the city is becoming or should become. And their voices are contrasted with another story of Bangalore told through the story of through the voice of Jagannath, who is the former Gram Panchayat president in Bengaluru, who was fighting a case against land acquisition, which a case that many of you might remember. Part 2, financial stratagems, is concerned with the volatility and precarity of finance in urban spaces. Here we focus on 3 kinds of financial flows, what we call high finance or global private equity capital coming into real estate projects in the city. The second is what Himangani Gupta in her chapter calls low finance, or the informal money lending and money lenders and chit funds that working class women especially rely upon to keep their households afloat. And third is state finance, where we highlight disinvestment from public services. My chapter in this section also digs into the processes of land assembly for real estate projects, especially in peri-urban villages. Together, these essays track how the ebb and flow of capital through separate but entangled circuits of accumulation have transformed the city's built environment in both intended and unintended ways. The third section, State Speculations, explore how new governance practices and state actors redesign public spaces to accommodate the financializing economy of the city. These projects cater to modern forms of consumption and promote transit systems that privilege elite desires and tend to marginalize low-income residents. The essay by Isha Kundur recounts how the demise of public sector enterprises in the city laid the groundwork for the new Bangalore, told through the voices of former trade union activists. Shaheen Shah's chapter underscores the importance of affordable, publicly funded mass transport in the form of the bus system for people's livelihoods and aspirations. And Usha Rao's chapter is on the metro, and she's here to speak about that in a few minutes. Part 4, Speculative Subjects, illustrates different ways in which speculation encompasses the city's elite and working class residents alike. These chapters reveal how ordinary people respond to the turbulence of urban life by engaging in small-scale rentiership and property brokerage. The essays also underscore the role of caste and class in the transformation of agricultural land into real estate and the creation of new property and rental markets. Chapter 12, which was based on our fieldwork in Yeshwanpur, follows the demolition and redevelopment of an old informal settlement as land values in the area soared and as multiple actors strategized to profit from the land captured from the urban poor. Swati's chapter 11 follows the transformation of a working class locality by small-scale real estate investments, while chapter 13 documents Dalit struggles for land and housing in the city, and Swati is here to speak about her chapters. Part 5, Labor in the Speculative City, explores the precarious forms of labor that underwrite the global city and the lifestyles of the middle class and elites. The chapters reveal the struggles, aspirations, and livelihood uncertainties of construction workers, street vendors, domestic helpers, gig workers, as they strive to earn, save, and secure a measure of dignity in the face of insecure housing, rising costs of living, and various forms of exclusion. Swati's chapter 15 relates the stories of migrant construction workers who toil in obscurity and lead uncertain lives in a city they cannot call home. Vinay Srinivasa writes about the struggles of street vendors in Bangalore who provide essential services to urban residents but are always under threat of eviction. Kaveri Medappa's chapter is a vivid kind of day in the life story of a young food delivery agent as he chases targets, grappling with the remorseless time discipline of the delivery app and Bangalore's unruly traffic. The last chapter, also by Swati, reveals the dilemmas and frustrations of Bangalore's domestic workers as they cope with changing employment relations and expectations in high-end apartment complexes. And finally, the sixth part looks at the environmental crisis, which we call ecologies of speculation. This section is concerned with the impact of rapid urbanization on the city's intricate water infrastructure, which, as we all know, has been largely built over, leading to regular flooding even as the city is increasingly water-starved. The essays explore Bangalore's environmental crisis from 4 perspectives: a working class locality confronting the conversion of their erstwhile tank or lake into a gated urban park in chapter 19, the same neighborhood dealing with sewage and wastewater flowing into their homes from the high-rise apartment complex that was built next door, and a farming community grappling with the existential loss of their now highly polluted lake. The final chapter is based on an interview with Bhargavi Rao, who's here today, and Leo Saldana, who, of course, headed or ran the Environment Support Group, a very important environmental NGO in Bangalore. And in this interview, they share their insights on Bangalore's ecological and social crisis and what might be done to overcome them. So that's an overview of the book. I would now request Swati to come and present her chapters.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for being here on a Sunday morning. I have I have a few chapters in the book, and but I thought I talk a little bit about what the book speaks to me in person, and hopefully I have some students of mine here, so I'm going to talk primarily to them in a way that hopefully they will take forward this kind of research. So. I think the book is important for us as people who are living here in Bangalore, people who study Bangalore, people who call this a home, call this a migrant destination. I think one of the most important things about that the book does is to defamiliarize the familiar, which is to say that what we see every day, it presents that to us in a new light, and that's broadly the way in which I would like to speak as well. And I think this book forms a new important contribution to Bangalore, the study of Bangalore, but the study of cities in general, in the sense, in the ways in which it focuses on the ordinary, on the very unremarkable aspects of urbanism or urbanization. Um, and I'm also really grateful that we have Dr. Janki Nair here, who's written a seminal book on Bangalore. And so it's almost, many of us started looking at Bangalore, studying Bangalore through her book. And so to see how Bangalore has transitioned as a subject, as a site of inquiry from the way in which Professor Nair did to now, which is a far more disparate account that we have, but disparate but connected account that we have in this book, which is primarily through stories of people who are trying to make a life in the city. So, with those sort of opening remarks, I guess I will begin by talking autobiographically in a way. I've been born and brought up in Bangalore, and I've seen. I've never found it very remarkable, the city, and I always wanted to get out of the city because I felt things were happening elsewhere, and nothing happens in Bangalore. So. So when I returned to Bangalore for various reasons, I moved into a suburban neighborhood in Bangalore, which is again a very ordinary, unremarkable sort of neighborhood. Um, but in the decade or so that I'd been away, it had moved from having houses which were primarily for people to live in to becoming a very sought after rental economy neighborhood as well. So, in the sense that people were no longer building for themselves and for their families, but they were also building um, um, one floor or one unit just to be able to rent out. And I think we've seen this across Bangalore, everywhere, people doing this sort of construction and speculating. This is the form of speculation that I want to talk about as well. That and as Carol said, rent in speculative urbanism is important. But how do we see that in as it plays out in the ordinary lives of individuals? So I think so that in that sense we see this everywhere. Rental economy is prolific across the city, and but so how do we study this? How do we pay attention to this form of urbanism? This is not a form of urbanism in some senses driven directly by IT investments or metro investments, etc. But nevertheless, this is a form of urbanism that prevails all around us, and I think the book does a very good job of capturing those insights of urbanism of this kind of built form. So this the chapters that has my name on it is built on the ethnographic labor of many of the team members that Carol and others had put together. So I drew upon the work of Kaveri Medappa and Himangini Gupta in order to write some of the chapters. And the some of my chapters deal with a colony which we call as the Karmikara colony. It's a pseudonym, of course, but it's located in what is now the heart of the city, or whatever you call as the heart of the city. But it's there, right in the middle, in the center of the city, I suppose. And it was a layout that was built by a development authority, the CITB, a predecessor of the BDA. And here they resettled people whose houses had been demolished in order to clear out a slum. So this was So this is a Karmikara colony in which many people were given 30 by 40 site, and a small modest house was built for them. And over a period of time, they received titles to these sites and then became owners of this place. So this many of the chapters in this books looks at the transformation that takes place. So I won't go into the details, but I think it's important to think about this 30 by 40 site, or this 1200 square meters of site, as a site of aspiration. And I think that's the job that this book does, to look at this 30 by 40 site, which is the site um, that the state has offered to many residents of Bangalore, but also something that is symbolic of a middle class aspiration in Bangalore. And so, built based on this land ownership that these individuals or these families have had, they go on to, and once they receive land titles, they go on to sell it and move and buy land elsewhere, or they build rental units in this place. So this neighborhood has transformed from this sleepy neighborhood with sort of large sites, 30 by 40 sites, to a really densely built locality. Again, this is a picture I'm sure that comes to many of your minds as well, when we've seen this everywhere. This where buildings don't follow building bylaws, don't have don't have the don't have space between buildings, etc., etc. So this is the layout of the Karmikara colony that we're talking about. And this is the transformation in build form, but what happens to individuals as well, and how do they individuals transform? This form of build form urbanism has led to two kinds of figures which are quite common on the Bangalore landscape, or on this landscape of any ordinary city, which is the real estate broker, the small time real estate broker, and the small time rentier landlord. Right. So these are two figures who control the rental economy in some sense, or who facilitate rental economy, which is to say that you want to rent a house, you will go to a broker, or you will end up having to work out with your landlord. So this is the form of speculative urbanism that this book talks about. We don't necessarily pay attention to these figures of the small time real estate broker, or the small landlord that has key critical figures in a story of the urban. And I think this book and some of my chapters do that work of paying attention to this new figure on the landscape of the urban. Um, the real estate broker is in particular really important because many of the brokers that we meet in the stories that we have are not just brokers. They're either auto rickshaw drivers, they're tailors, uh, they've run a taxi service before. So they do 2, 3 odd jobs, but they also do this kind of brokerage work. Right? And that is also the nature of work in the city, that you're no longer doing just one thing. It's not a career that you have, but this form of speculative urbanism shapes the ways in which we also engage with work. And the real estate broker we see in the story, many of them are looking for that one deal that set them for life, right? And that's really the is symptomatic of life in an in the urban, but also it speaks to possibilities of a good deal, right? A good deal that will set you for life. And that's the stories that of these individuals that we encounter in these stories. But the rental economy is also incredible, is also entirely private. We don't in India have state intervention into the rental economy, which means then that is entirely market led. So when it's market led, it also brings in the social prejudices as well. So we find that the rental market operates along lines of exclusion. So we found brokers who tell us what is the criteria of a good tenant, right? So someone who's not a single woman, someone who's not a bachelor, someone who doesn't have a dog because dogs can bark, someone who don't have big families because water is a scarcity when it comes to when you have multiple rental units, and most poignantly, of course, the Muslim. Right. So these are individuals, these are figures who are excluded from mainstream rental economy, and that I think is um, one of the outcomes of the rental economy being entirely private, right? And there are no imperatives of social justice that potentially that the state could bring in. And I think, and while we don't necessarily talk about it in the book, but I think that's something that for us to draw upon in terms of what are some of the effects of leaving something as important as housing entirely over to the private, entirely over to the market. Um, that's the story again that's a critique also that organizations like the Slum Janandolana Karnataka, which is an organization of which works for the rights of slum dwellers, slum residents in the city as well as in the state. So we have a chapter which I think is one of the most forceful, important chapters in the book. It's entirely based on the interview of Narasimha Murthy, who's been a key figure in the movement for housing rights in the state. Uh, um, I've been a journalist before, and I've engaged with this slum rights movement, etc., as a journalist. And it was always, there was one narrative that was clear to me, which is that the right to the city, that the argument of the right to the city that slum residents do, or some residents have made, as well as their organizations have made. So this is a right to the city, saying that we labor for the city, we offer the city services. It could be domestic work, it could be construction work, it could be all kinds of informal sector work. So we have a right to the city, and that has always been the argument that is made by slum rights organizations. But I met Narasimha 10 to 12 years later for this particular chapter, and he was saying something else, which I thought again was symptomatic of, symbolic at least, of what the book is trying to capture. So he kept talking about evictions, but not evictions by the state, evictions by the market. And so when I probed further, one of the things that he talked about was um, how the state would come in to give, say, titles to land, to sites in for Dalit households or for slum residents. But over time, as the city develops around it, um, s- Dalit households or slum households end up selling selling the site and moving out. So he termed this as market led evictions in a way, right? And I think that is something that is important for us to pay attention to. He also had another critique, which is of offering slum residents houses and not ownership of land. And he said that that takes away a right to speculate. Now, if as a middle class household, I can build units above my house because I have clear title ownership of the land. This is not something that is available for households, particularly low income households. They're given houses which they cannot expand, which they cannot rebuild, and they don't have ownership of the land. So they do not have the right to speculate in a rental economy. And I think that is really important, really important intervention or a moral critique that Narasimha Murthy makes, that the state giving only houses to the poor prevents them from being part of this speculative economy. And so I urge you all to read that chapter to talk about. So I think this offers us a different way of looking at the right to the city discourse, which is not merely, which is not only, very importantly, not only a right to the city in terms of I labor, but also the right to be able to speculate as well. And so I think that's something that's really important. I'll end by talking a little bit about the reshaping of labor in as the city morphs into a speculative one. So we have in this in the book we focus on there are three stories: one of the construction worker, one of the domestic worker, and Kaveri Mehtapa's work on following a gig worker. These are all some of these professions, like domestic work, of course, has a longer history in India, in the city, but but this chapter essentially looks at the nature of work and how that transforms. So we follow the life of one individual we call Lalita, who works with who worked for a very long time in an old elite neighborhood nearby Karmikara colony, which is where she's from. And the Karmikara colony was a colony which offered such kind of domestic services to these old elite upper caste, upper class neighborhoods. So in this, for a long time in her life, in her work as a domestic worker, as a cook, she there were relationships of patronage that were built. So they were these. I'm not arguing that this was not exploitative in any way, or that this was entirely fair, but this was an older form of work relationship where patronage, where benevolence of the employer. And this, I think, we all must recognize as well, that domestic workers who worked in households for long periods of time, they develop more than worker kind of relationships. So she speaks about, so Lalita's story talks about this kind of relationships of patronage that is very different from the kinds of relationship of work that you have in these gated complexes. So she draws this distinction between working as a domestic worker in gated communities where she's subject to great degree of surveillance, where the work is exploitative, where there's no relationship beyond that of work, as opposed to these older elite neighborhoods where there was patronage and benevolence that um, somehow kept the relationship of work going, and there was some dignity associated with this older form of work. So domestic work, as we all know, has expanded exponentially as the city has grown, and the state and domestic workers organizations have been working to institutionalize and legalize certain rights of domestic workers. But that's not a story that we discuss in this. But nevertheless, this really changing nature of work, and what a speculative subject that gets constituted within, or rather how work itself is reshaped because of this kind of new migrants coming in, is something that this chapter really looks at. The last bit that I want to talk about is the construction worker. We follow the life of an old woman called Amba, who used to work as a construction worker and has now been excluded from the workforce because she's old, and her body can no longer take the toil of manual labor that construction work is. And she asks us a question, and which I think is something that I'd like to leave you all with. And she says, is this because my body has grown soft and that can no longer do the work of manual labor, does this mean that I do not have a right to live? And I think this is the exploitation that takes place at a different level, which is that workers who come in, the gig workers, construction workers, those who are doing hard manual labor, they're not just laboring, but they're also sacrificing their vitality, the vitality of their bodies, in order to be able to labor for the city. And I think that is the that is the work that gets captured with Kaveri Medappa's work on gig worker and on the construction worker, where young people are coming in doing incredibly difficult manual labor, and they're literally having to sacrifice their bodies for the speculative economy to persist. So, thank you.
Again, a big thank you for coming. And it's nice to see some familiar faces. And I also want to thank Carol and everyone and the rest of the editors for inviting me to contribute to this wonderful book, which I think if you like cities, if you love Bangalore, or you're just interested in what goes on in city making, I think you should pick up a copy. I just want to start with my chapter, which is called Metro Mutations, is about the Bangalore Metro. And as many of us, or most of us in this room already know, the metro has had all kinds of incredibly deep shifts in the way our city has grown, the way we experience the city, and what it actually means to move around in the city. And hence the name Metro Mutations, because it has changed the city in irrevocable and irreversible ways. So the chapter talks a little bit about the on-the-ground experience of the metro and the ways in which it ties up with the larger theme of the book, which is speculation. So what does the coming of a metro line or a station do to the life of a small business owner who runs an establishment? What happens to the space, or should we say land, once it has been acquired? What or whom does the metro actually serve? These questions have emerged through my ethnographic work on the metro. I've traversed spaces, trains, offices, had conversations with commuters, metro workers, union leaders, and officials, and sometimes clandestinely because you don't have access to the metro as a researcher. And some of these stories have made their way into this book under the Metro Mutations chapter. Today, I'd like to read a passage, an extract that specifically highlights the connections between the metro and the theme of speculation and its impact on the life of people and places. Later, I'd like to share some slides that relate to other stories in the chapter. Halasuru Metro Station is the pause between two hectic stops, Trinity Station on MG Road and Indiranagar. The western entrance opens out onto a chipped and worn footpath which hosts a perennial pool of stagnant water. The station is a favorite roosting spot for local pigeons that gather in large numbers on the roofs and along the grimy glass windows. The floor is splattered with white spots which are occasionally mopped up by the skeleton housekeeping staff. Unlike the glossy floors and interiors of stations in the more upmarket areas of MG Road and Indiranagar, or those adjoining malls, Alsur is a quote-unquote low footfall location. According to the BMRCL project manager, all stations are cost centers. The revenue from ridership and rentals at the Halasuru station does not justify the cost of hiring extra staff needed to keep it squeaky clean. The station interiors echo hollowly, waiting for retail stalls to claim their place, in contrast to the cramped and bustling market a stone's throw away, Alsur's Bazaar Street. For most of the day, the station is quiet and empty. In one corner, I spot a sign, Space for ATM. Although it was expected that Halasuru station would have less traffic than its two neighboring ones, what warrants its large footprint? It appears that the extensive space that has ingested homes, corners of temples, and shops was acquired in anticipation of future revenues. One day, while I sat inside the station control room with Ashok, the rookie station controller, a young woman walked in to sign the register. Ashok introduced her as the Retail Development Officer for Halsuru, who is responsible for seeking out, publicizing, and attracting bids for rentals inside the station. Rentals and footfalls are essential for turning stations into profit centers. The logic of retail within stations is simply stated as convenience for the commuter to pick up his daily needs. However, contrary to this claim by the former managing director, the shops that do come up inside are not basic grocery or fresh produce stores. The preference is for established food and beverage brands like Cafe Coffee Day, Nandini Milk Parlors, Domino Pizzas, and Chai Point shops for gifts, knickknacks, aggregator cabs, and other retail chain retailers. Despite the hot denials made by officials in the early days, the conjoining of retail rentals and metro lines has been publicly acknowledged as part of the design and financial model of the metro. Stations are expected to become retail destinations. This is apparent on the Green Line, which has 3 prominent retail destination stations: the high-end Orion and Mantri malls, and more recently, IKEA, the Swedish brand, which has set up shop at the tail end of the line. Corporate partnerships and investments are exchanged for retail space within and abutting stations. Halsuru, according to this blueprint, must languish and wait for commuter consumers to arrive. Perhaps this will materialize sometime in the future after the neighborhood undergoes the required mutation that increases footfalls. Until the coming of that future, it remains a convivial spot for the local pigeons to gather. So essentially, this is about transformation of land. A dwelling, a shop, or a road corner, park, or playground, once it's acquired by the metro, becomes privatized and transforms into real estate. Specifically, stations are not just landing places for commuters, but they are potential profit centers that are expected to yield rent. So large footprints of stations hold space, as it were, for rentals yet to materialize. I'd just like to show you something from my work. So those of you who are familiar with the MG Road metro station, when you enter MG Road from the MG Road end and you look to your left, and if you look really carefully at the end of the open space, you see a little grimy window. And it's very innocuous. You hardly notice it. But this used to be the site that was occupied by the Phoenix Watchworks, and which stretched all the way up to the end of the window. And this store was in Ramachandra Sharma's family for 80 years, and he practically grew up in this shop. So he had a very close connect with, of course, the shop as well as the area. This was acquired by the metro for the, as you know, the MG Road station. Now, the interesting thing is, and he was also not compensated adequately, being that he was a tenant. So interestingly, if you go in there, I've seen this space over the years. So it would be this whole space, which used to be the shop, it was used for pop-up stores like this one selling blankets. Then on another visit, I saw that a kiosk had come up. One doesn't know exactly what it's selling, but it's there. And essentially, the whole space is lying vacant, hoping that some rentals would materialize over there. And of course, if any station you go to, whether it's Alsur or RV Road in Jayanagar or MG Road, the area is vast. Again, all waiting to be populated by rentals. And of course, they don't just wait for the rentals to walk in. Here is a sign that advertises rentals, rather crudely put together, but here it is. for a world-class metro station to be advertising rentals. Right. So that is one kind of transformation. So land value extraction, as explained in this story, is essential for running the metro. Fare box revenues, which is the ticket money which is collected, is not adequate. Although now it is running at 10 lakhs of commuters per day, it's still inadequate to pay salaries for metro workers. So the Bangalore Metro relies heavily, like other metros elsewhere, on what they call non-fare box revenues, which is essentially rentals, advertisements, and wrapping trains in advertisement, swaddling, whatever it's called, and all the rest of it, which has nothing to do with ridership. So if you read the papers, BMRCL regularly announces that it's increasing the square feet within stations for more and more rentals. And developers like Mantri, Embassy, and others have partnered with BMRCL to build stations in return for retail space. So there is a close nexus between real estate, developers, rentals, and the metro. So it's not just about, as many of us already know, it's not just about mass transit. And of course, the entire metro project itself is built on huge mega international loans from banks such as Japanese International Cooperation Agency, the Asian Development Bank, and who have all parked their money, as it were, as low interest loans in this huge infrastructure project, which is again looking to the future for profits. Next, I want to talk about another kind of transformation that is very common to the coming of a metro alignment, and which is, and here is again, this is a more gentle example from MG Road. Many of us here in this room with hair like mine would remember the MG Road Boulevard, which was extremely extremely tolerant of the occasional drunk, the loiterer, the flaneur, the peanut vendor, and of course lovebirds who sat along its bougainvillea path. And these two are images which have got from open source in the public page on Facebook, and the image on your right, the young men there who are now older men actually posted it because it was part of their nostalgic trip. So in the process, after it was acquired by the metro, it of course underwent tremendous change. The bougainvilleas were gone, the metro pillars came up, and the boulevard was broken, and then the Rangoli Center emerged out of the rubble. And it's a wonderful place. You can go there, you can do a drum circle, there's a gallery, there's a theater, and of course there's a host of housekeeping staff that keeps it very clean. But the difference being that this is a very monitored space, and it has a very curated market where, again, vendors have to rent the space, but it's very charmingly called Nagarat Pete, which is a nod to Avenue Road, which is nothing like Avenue Road. But the point I'm trying to make is that what was a public space largely has transformed itself into this kind of, there's a security guard, a friendly person, but he's there nevertheless. And it's maintained by a real estate company, and it's got a tindi shop where you have to go and buy your tindi, so you will not meet the peanut vendor anymore here. So it's transformed itself into a very kind of monitored area. So you can ask the question, how public is this really? The more poignant story is that of what has happened to playgrounds in the process of metro acquisition for metro stations. This is my work on the Bamboo Bazaar Banda ground, which is not, it's just a mention in the chapter, but I've written about it elsewhere, but I felt it was important to talk about it. So this was the Banda ground, which was home to the community. It's a lower middle class and lower income community, very mixed. And this was the only open space they had, adults and children, to come together, pray, play, and celebrate. And one fine day, the metro changed its mind about the alignment. That's a whole other story. I don't want to get into it right now. And it was acquired. And the Bamboo Bazaar station was to come here. So then it went through the process of green walling and completely demolishing. So right now you don't have access, and the community that was using this space is completely left with no public space, because tragically, within a 4-kilometer stretch of the pink line, which is yet to come, 3 major playgrounds which were feeding the lives and souls of kids, especially in that area, are gone. So this is, so again, these spaces which were commons once have been will be transformed into metro stations where you don't have free access, no free access, and therefore whole communities deprived of, and the cost of this is not actually factored into the building of the metro at all. And in fact, metro officials often see these open spaces, agricultural lands, playgrounds, and parks as empty spaces and refer to them as empty spaces. So this is the other kind of mutation that happens. And again, this goes into it becomes part of real estate. I just want to, at this point, very quickly touch upon Shaheen Shasha's work. Since I just thought there's a good contrast between the metro and the bus. Yes, and the buses, because the buses carry 48 lakh people and the metro carries 10 lakh people. Yet the funds for buses are cut down, they're slashed, and the people who give us essential services are left out of the means of mobility. The last section, because of time, I could dwell more on it, but maybe we can take questions on that, is I want to talk about what happens. Why is it that the metro, which is supposed to serve intracity, is extending into the hinterland? And the latest controversy is the Tumkur line. Why is it going into another town? And so when the first phase of the metro started, the Green Line was planned to go along Kanakpura Road. And even before the metro, when it was just a squiggle on a map, real estate developers started their work going in this area, and huge developments came up. So what used to be the hinterland, and Carol talks about it in her chapter, where was aggregated into real estate, agricultural land, open spaces, old homes, were had to give way to the metro, and it again not only transforms the hinterland, and at the cost of the large old trees that lined the Kanakpura Road, which is a very old highway, and just kind of change the way that the city actually looks. And this is the famous Jinke Mane, which is in ruins, and this is my photograph when it was demolished. And this next is from a blog. This is how it looked with a beautiful facade. And then you have structures like this is the Forum Mall, which is this estuarian kind of feeling you get when you walk into it. The point I'm trying to make here is, apart from the aesthetics and so on, is that the metro is actually thrusting itself into the hinterland and building the city along the way. So you can ask, who is it really serving? Is it serving commuters within the city, or is it actually building the city? And Rashmi Sadhna, who's worked on the metro in Delhi, calls it a blueprint for building the city and building a new kind of urban or a futuristic urban landscape. So I can just stop it there, because although I just do want to say that what it does do is the metro then becomes a conduit for connecting new kinds of land forms of development, high-end mixed-use development that Vinay Gidwani writes about in this book, that spring along the alignment even before the pillars come up, and gated communities and so on. So it works as a mutation corridor that actually changes what a city looks like and and it pushes the boundaries of the city where there is no going back, and it just keeps moving in this amoebic fashion. I'll end by showing a slide which is kind of dystopian, but it is Apupan's work from a graphic novel. He says, did we ever have a choice? And this is what they have left for our children. Thank you. Namaskara. Good afternoon to everybody. Thanks to Carol for this wonderful opportunity. So Leo and I have been interviewed in this book as part of the last chapter. And it's very beautiful the way Michael Goldman started this conversation. He started with our own lived experiences of what it was to grow up in Bangalore. And both Leo and I are somebody who were born in Bangalore, raised in Bangalore, lived in Bangalore all our lives. And we've seen neighborhoods transform over a period of time. I particularly grew up between Wilson Gardens and a little bit of Baswangudi. And in Baswangudi, I grew up very close to this place called Nippon Electronics. And the only thing I remember of that place is all the workers having a protest march every now and then. And as children, I remember playing Let's Play the Karmikarige Jayavagali game. And we would walk around our homes with, tree trunks and twigs and things like that. And also having been raised in a family where everybody at that time worked in the public sector. So we also saw the kind of townships the public sectors had created, and also the way public sectors had not extracted so much from the city, unlike what the IT and the BT did. They did give back something to the city. For example, the underground drainage system was first created by the public sector, and their buses were available to all other people as well. Once in a while, their schools and public health centers, hospitals were open to others as well. So we grew up like that, but suddenly, the city kind of changed. So Michael Goldman asks us how we got into this work, and it captures my own lived experiences and Leo's lived experiences in Gavipuram, which is just behind Baswangudi. And it captures how the original planning of Bangalore, as we all know, the plague hit in 1898, 1900, which again, Janaki Nayar's book is something which has been a Bible at ESG for all of us who work there, reading through the many chapters. So it captures how at the intersection of caste, class, religion, the original planning also took place in Bangalore. And then eventually Michael talks about the issue of water. And given that ESG had worked on all kinds of issues, we challenged the metro. We have challenged the issue of landfills. We managed to shut down 2 landfills in the city. And we focus in the chapter on the issue of lakes. And we discuss how, as an organization, we worked around the 4 lakes which were originally privatized, and talk about how we went campaigning house to house in those neighborhoods, asking people to come for a protest. And it was still easy because this was 2008, 9, 10. People still kind of would come easily for a protest. And we've managed to hold candlelight vigils around Hebbal Lake. We managed to create a human chain around the Agara Lake, which was privatized. So it talks about those kind of campaigns and movements and what it was to get people together, mobilize people together, how we managed to get some of the eminent citizens of the city to be part of these campaigns. L.V. Sharda, a very famous actress, also related to Usha Rao, was part of the campaign, and she herself had made a film called Kere Hadu. So it was a lovely time for an organization to kind of engage with the local community, bring them on board, and help take these voices to the decision makers. And the entire chapter also captures about how going to court was basically, highlighting the provisions in the Constitution
highlighting the environmental jurisprudence, particularly the precautionary principle, intergenerational equity, which is so key when it comes to a city like Bangalore and its resources. And the chapter also covers how, while on one side it is a global city, a Silicon city, an ITBT city with so much of science and technology, how we manage to not look at the water security of the city, given that the city it has a ridge that runs from north to south, dividing it into three valleys, and the city had kind of evolved based on its tanks and the early knowledge of how these tanks evolved and how they were interconnected with each other. But how, as a ITBT city, we managed to destroy it completely. And we've also destroyed the two rivers that actually originate inside the city, the Vrishabhavati and the Arkavati. And we talk a little bit about that. And then we go on to say how the building bylaws and other things got diluted or violated, and those violations were granted permission later, post facto clearances were given, and how the eastern part of the city has largely got concretized. And it is because of that concretization, we saw the worst of the floods there, and we continue to see the worst of the floods there. And when these floods happen, obviously it is the poor and the marginal who bear the brunt of it. Another important part of this entire study was ESG was also part of this larger project that Carol spoke about, the Great Transformation. We had also done a very small part of the study along with Vinay Bendur and others in North Bangalore, where the airport came up. So this airport, the Kempegowda airport, came in 2008, and we did the study sometime in 2005, 6, 7, I think. And we had done a bunch of interviews there, and every time I'm in and out of the airport, something that I remember is Terminal 1 sits on a village called Arshinakunte. That entire village was evicted in the monsoon of 2005, and they were displaced 15 kilometers away in another place called Balepura Dinne, on the grazing pasture of that village. So there was enmity between these new settlers and the old settlers, and they were not allowed to go into the same ration shops or use the same public health centers. There was kind of enmity, and the worst of the stories was the dead were not allowed to bury the bodies in the burial ground because the old settlers would not allow the new settlers. So this was the kind of divide this entire modernization and development of Bangalore caused. And many of the stories that Swati also shared and Usha shared take me back to some of those interviews. And we had realized that many of the people, so the basic idea of the project was also about to understand what happens to people who are displaced. Where are they? What are they doing now? How have they managed to cope with life? So these things came across very beautifully. And we had realized that while the rich had managed to kind of, really do extremely well, the small and the medium people, like Swati shared, had also turned into real estate agents. On one side, they had petty shops, and on other side, they had these real estate business going on, which was very interesting. And many, of course, had come to Bangalore, some to Tumkur and other places to work in the gig economy, and much of it is covered in the book. So many of the stories that are in the book, written in the other essays, all came to my mind while we were discussing with Michael. And of course, the larger part of the last chapter focuses on the lakes, the way ESG first questioned it, mobilized people. We had campaigns. We tried to work with this new organization that was set up, new agency that was set up, the Lake Development Authority. As we all know, it is another parastatal. So this parastatal, the first thing it did was to privatize lakes. The 4 lakes that got privatized. So we went to court, and the court set up a committee. The committee worked with a bunch of naturalists and others and came out with a very good report. It is called the N.K. Patil Committee Report. I would urge all of you all to read it. And it is the first time in the history of the country that N.K. Patil was a sitting judge at that time, and he headed this lake committee. And everything that gave as part of the committee report was copied verbatim into the final judgment. So this final judgment came in April 2012. But even after the final judgment, there was no move to protect the lakes, except for the fact that some CSR monies had gone in to lake protection. But what had happened was the CSR money was not going to do anything more than just band-aid beautification. So they had turned all the lakes into what we call as soup bowl structures. So lakes typically have a shallow region and a deeper region, and lakes across South India are supposed to be seasonal. They're not supposed to be perennial. But what the CSR money had done had created these soup bowl structures that completely changed the ecology of these lakes. So we managed to kind of see all of that. And despite the fact that nothing had been done after the final order in 2012, we went back to court in 2013 with a contempt petition and managed to bring in better orders so that all the departments concerned with water lake management would take notice of this new judgment. And even after that, there were a whole lot of challenges with encroachments, and encroachments not just by the poor, it was largely by the rich, big educational institutions, politicians, so on and so forth. The beauty of the 2012 judgment was that two things. One, it said that if there are encroachments and if it is occupied by the poor people, they have to be rehabilitated. And only after rehabilitation should lake rejuvenation take place. And this was a great example, which you still see today in the Subramanyapura Kere in South Bangalore, in Uttarali area, where Leo actually fought that the grazing pasture of the Subramanya Uttarhalli be given to the slum development board, and you literally see it. All the people who had encroached there, the poor settlers, had been shifted to this. Of course, there are problems with the slum development board building. It is going to crumble any time. There's no solid waste management. All of that is there, but at least they have some shelter. So that was one good thing. And the second thing that Leo argued for was while the judge was giving out the judgment, he said, can you type it in that this judgment be applied to all the lakes across Karnataka? So it covered 40,000 odd lakes of Karnataka. And that is what is protecting all the lakes in Karnataka today. So the beauty of it is all the lakes today are fenced, mapped. The solid waste is no longer going, at least in most of the places. And then the Karnataka State Legal Services Authority took cognition of this, and they started working with us. And we conducted workshops in 5 to 6 districts across Karnataka, training the taluk level people and the panchayat level people and all the other line departments, so that everybody is aware of the judgment. And the judgment basically says that every lake should eventually have a lake protection committee. And these lake protection committees are also at the taluk level, the panchayat level, district level. And then there is an apex committee. So it saw that there are all kinds of checks and balances so that lakes are not held by private institutions or individuals, but it is it has the eyes of all the various departments. It's very unfortunate that we live in a country where we are governed by parastatals, but throughout this argument, something that we had been pushing for was the implementation of the Town and Country Planning Act. This is not just in the lake story, but also in the metro story. Then another thing that we had been highlighting was to ensure that the 73rd and the 74th Amendment be implemented with its letter and spirit. And that is again something that it was for the first time in history of India. Because of the court cases in Karnataka, at least for some time, the ward committees function. But I think the chapter largely raises all these questions and possibilities. And for students, I think it is a great learning. It can be made mandatory reading in many of the universities to understand what is happening in the city, how a city like Bangalore depends on water resources that are so far away. All of you know the fact that we are getting water from like almost 100 kilometers away and at a great cost of electricity. And given that it again doesn't reach everybody, it only reaches part of the city. And it also raises questions of how in the past lakes were used by local communities like the fishermen and dhobis and others. And the local villagers also did some basic agriculture during the summer months. So it highlights all of this and takes us back to, what history, the governance of lakes historically and what has happened to it now. The fact that lakes are under the jurisdiction of so many bodies, although there is the Karnataka KLTCDA, what we call. So I will leave you with that because of shortage of time, but I would urge all of you all to read the book. It's a great read. Talk about it, share it with your social circles, and make it mandatory reading in all your educational institutions. Thank you.
Period of time left to us, and we have to make the best of it. Now, I had prepared a few things to say. I will be as brief as possible. This is incidentally the cover of the Minnesota Press book. I think our local cover is a vast improvement. And thank you to all the panelists for having shared some aspects of the book with an audience here. I hope it'll encourage you to actually go out and then also to read this very important book. I will, as I said, try to keep my comments very brief and short. I'm going to zoom out because most of the chapters are talking about very specific kinds of people and structures and events and so on and so forth, whereas I'm going to sort of try and set it in a slightly longer historical perspective and also to raise a few questions. But let me start by quoting the 17th century Kannada poet Sarvajna, who had the prescience to ask in the 17th century, can the one who drained the tank to build a house now fear the flood? I mean, should we not have known what awaits us in this rampant draining of the lakes, which are so crucial to this ecology of the city, when they were being done? And we have all those of us, and I'm again, I should claim that I'm one of those who grew up in Bangalore, and although I was exiled from the city for a period of 3 decades, I'm happy to be back. Although, as Walter Benjamin said when he was writing about the city, it is important to be estranged for the city in order to be able to write about it. And I think in my case, that has certainly happened. I'm completely estranged from this thing that surrounds me. I do not recognize a single thing. And it's good and it's important, and it helps us to make sense of what is going on. So, this rampant building that has happened, which ignores all ecological limits, is only one part of the story. The other part of the story is, of course, what some of the others have already spoken about, the discrepant temporalities, that there is one kind of temporality that capital seems to be following. There is another kind of temporality that people who make their lives on the margins seem to be following. And does this one space have the capacity to sustain this kind of discrepant temporality? I have in my introduction, and I have to say with some pleasure here, that, I have for long taught a course on the modern city. And one teaches it, the history of the modern city, as a bounded space, as something that has boundaries, that has a recognizable urban form, that has recognizable cultural characteristics. And certainly what is happening today seems to challenge that idea of the city as a bounded space. It's something that is now so widely spread out that it fails to sort of stay within boundaries. And I'm not just talking about physical boundaries, but that there is so much changing that the kind of ways in which we understood the modern city as a bounded space perhaps need to be altered. And I'm going to come to that in just a minute. But I want to pick up on one aspect that Bhargavi talked about, but only fleetingly, because it was one of the important things that I wanted to raise here, which is that as a city, Bangalore has very, very important bodies of people who are doing the kind of work which tells us the way forward. We have bodies of experts, scientific experts, technical experts, people who have studied what has happened to transportation systems, people who have studied the importance of the water bodies to this space, people who have studied the impact of bringing water from more than 125 kilometers away uphill. How long can this be sustained? And yet, what we have is widespread neglect of the expert. There is not a city that is ruled by experts. The experts perform their task. The decisions that are taken seem to be following another trajectory altogether. So, we need to ask this question, why there is this extraordinary gulf between expert knowledge, which seems to be useful for understanding the processes through which the city is going, or any city, but I'll take Bangalore as the example, and the way in which that knowledge is ignored. Just today, those of you who have read today's newspaper will already know that D.K. Shivkumar has rather proudly, flagged the fact that the Indian Institute of Engineers has said that the tunnel project is the only answer for Bangalore's traffic problems. In spite of the fact that there are enough, it's not just people shouting, saying that the tunnel is inappropriate because it's endangering the space of the city, but also those who have studied the fact that the creation of this kind of facility will only exacerbate the problem by the time it comes into being, which is, by the way, some 10 or 20 years down the line. We are adding, we are already 1.35 crore vehicles on the road. So far, nobody has spoken about this vehicular traffic and the kinds of problems it creates. But I'm saying there is a disjunct between this kind of knowledge, technical knowledge, of which we have plenty, serious studies. ESG is a good example of the kinds of studies that have been generated, and the political and economic logics that actually seem to be resulting in making these decisions. It's something that we need to really spend some time talking about. But as I said, the kinds of developments that have happened have brought the categories by which we understand the city into crisis. And I think this book is a good example of taking this as an opportunity to rethink what are the categories through which we can now understand this unwieldy thing which is lying out before us. And one of the most useful ways is, of course, to look at the developments, this sprawling, unbounded entity from below. And I think this is what the book does, and it does it in a very sensitive way. It is doing it through, through these vignettes, which are extremely insightful. It is also revealing to us, and I think that's part of since my book was invoked by one or two people, let me just say there's been more than 20 years since I wrote it, and in 20 years things have also vastly changed. But I think what one noticed even 20 years ago was that the city is no longer sort of relating to the immediate hinterland. It's not a city that has links with the immediate hinterland in any creative or productive way. Its links are now global. It is being shaped by global forces. It is not being shaped by our immediate hinterland. It is being shaped by all kinds of global forces. This is what, in fact, very well-known people who study the city, such as David Harvey, have noted about the fact that one can actually end up feeling rather helpless about the kinds of forces that are shaping our cities, because they are no longer in our immediate surroundings. They are no longer actors in our immediate surroundings. The second thing we know, of course, is that this is a site of immaterial production. We've moved away, and I don't want to go into the nostalgic mode at all here, but I do think that the shift from public sector, which was for material goods and services to some extent, has now completely, or more or less, we are told almost on a daily basis, there are 25 lakh IT workers in the city, to immaterial production. But more important, we have relied so much on an infrastructure that is managing the surplus that is being produced rather than producing the surplus, as it were. So, the banks, the financial agencies, and so on and so forth. So, I'm rushing here, but I just want to say that it brings these kinds of binaries into crisis. What is the difference between the binaries which we may have been a bit more comfortable with in the past, such as legal, illegal, rural, town, country, town and country, or the distinction between culture and nature, and so on and so forth. And this is therefore a time for an opportunity, as I would say, and I think the book represents this opportunity for taking forward the task of recasting what our conceptual tools should be. I started my own career as a labor historian, so I have, of course, been able to those who belonged to the organized and protected sectors of work. The emblematic figure of the 1950s and the 60s was indeed the public sector worker, and even the urban plans took account of that. I've spoken about this in my own book, but if you read the plans of the 50s and 60s, there was interest in housing these workers, and Bhargavi and others have already mentioned the kinds of achievements that the public sector has resulted in terms of urban planning of the townships. But what is the emblematic figure today? It is, of course, the gig worker. It is not even the I would say, this 25 lakh tech worker body whom we are constantly. And I think one of the most interesting interesting chapters in the book was this study of the Zomato worker that was done by Kaveri Medappa, who was gone around just the sheer agony of the kind of work which is self-exploitative. So please let us understand what this is. You have to exploit your own time and your own resources in order to make ends meet. It is, it's actually an extraordinary story, and really worth spending time reading about. It's also interesting that the city has, again, the introduction, I think, mentions this to some extent, has moved away from an earlier nod towards its public sector worker and to its organized sector workers in the form of the representation that these people had in the legislature. So just to give you an example of something some of you may know, but many of you may not, M.S. Krishnan was the representative from Rajaji Nagar. He was a CPI, a Communist Party of India person. He represented in some ways the working class in the legislature for many terms. Imagine that our legislature today has 26 out of 28 Bangalore MLAs who represent real estate interests. So we cannot expect that the legislature is actually going to take interest. I mean, they say business and they say social work and so on, but we all know that, if you have a name like Layout Krishnappa and you're elected to the legislature, we know what your interests are. So I'm just saying there's been a massive shift where the structures of power itself are reflecting this speculation that has been laid out in this book. And so we are at actually a very critical moment, that this, what can stop it, what can halt it? Certainly not the political class, which is well representing this interest. So we really need to think, what is it that how can we respond to this crisis, not just as academics, what I've described as a crisis of categories, but also as people who are actually activists, who are people who are challenging through the law and so on and so forth. This book gives us a very interesting vignette, but having said vignette, don't let me give you the impression that somehow it is some kind of disconnected story that we're talking about. There is thick description here of various kinds of sectors of the economy, and as many have already mentioned, and I have also talked about in some pieces of writing, it's not something, the speculation is not confined only to the the international real estate interests or to local real estate interests or to politicians. It is filtered down to almost everybody who resides in the city, who can, as a form of accumulation, as one of the only sources of economic and social mobility. You go to a place, I've written about this, Murphy Town, for example, which was intended as a site for raising the level of cobblers and leather workers. When it was laid out, as a place which had these 9 big sort of central open areas surrounded by these small, very nice cottages. Now it is unrecognizable because almost everybody has built up on their respective sites and has built up rental housing. So it's not the interest in speculation is not confined to only one layer of society. Just as we know that illegality is not something that is only performed by the poor. Illegalities, even of the state, are quite rampant. And I want to bring in something that has so far not come up in this discussion much, and that is the question of caste. Because one of the things that I have noted also in my book is the foundational sort of deformation of planning by the operation of caste. Whether you look at Basangudi or you look at Malleshwaram, there were these foundational categories of caste which determined who got what kind of space there. But this is something that has been secularized. And the work of Prakash Rao and Tiwari, which none of you has mentioned, but is a very important book for studying Bangalore city, all written in the 70s, also mentions how there has been the secularization of caste, so it becomes invisible. There is a congruence between lower casteness and very small areas or slum areas in a city like Bangalore is something to pay attention to. But I was struck by the fact that in Swati is one of many chapters that Swati has written. She talks about this Lingayat woman who's battling the floods that have entered her house. And her complaint is not, oh, look, you've not planned the city well, and whatever, this is a encroachment that has actually resulted in this, but that I am losing caste by cleaning up the dirt of other people. What are you doing to me? You're like making me lose caste. I mean, I was really struck by this example as something that actually defines the way you are, belonging in some ways to the city, and the kinds of problems that it poses. But I think we ended on a good note in terms of Bhargavi telling us that there is hope, that there are things that have been achieved through the litigation that ESG has taken up. And I want to also end on this note of hope, again by citing Zoran Mamdani, who has had the courage to dream differently and we are yet to see what he will achieve. But I think even if he achieves very little or nothing at all, I think he has shown the way for us to be able to imagine the city differently. We have to imagine the city as not driven by the automobile. I mean, it has to go beyond automobiles to see who are the people who actually use the city. Can the city sparkle once more with blue water bodies? I think it can, provided we have our priorities right. We not create more facilities for cars, but perhaps to tax car ownership in the same way that the much admired city of Singapore does. And, to be able to speak and bring to the attention of not just our public, but also the politicians, that there should be an account taken of the people who are represented in this book, whose lives are precarious and whose lives are indeterminate. So this book is, let me put it frankly, this book is a little dystopic, but that is not paving the way for pessimism. It is actually opening up the possibility of, first of all, the book is really distancing itself from that other cottage industry of books about Bangalore, which is all about nostalgia, cantonment, how wonderful it was, and all these villas and gardens and this and that and so on, garden city, etc. It's really not striking that note here. And I really admire the fact that, you've moved away and looked at, as it were, the contemporary city with fresh eyes. And it also undermines these techno scientific fixes as the answer to the problems of the city. So, I'll end here by just saying the word cosmopolitan is often used to describe Bangalore. Usually, it only implies that you're not obliged to learn the local language. I would like to say, let's think of a cosmopolitical future. What would that look like? And what are the kinds of restraints that should be placed on, the kinds of forces that are shaping the city? Can the citizenry actually raise some of these questions? I think we have some answers in this book. Thank you on that note. And let's take questions from the audience. I think our panel is here now, and we can. And I apologize for rushing through what I had to say.
So I would like to ask that there is a negotiation of the morphology of the city, which people negotiate, the body encountering the city in various ways. For example, in the bus transport, for example, the steps of the bus, the pavements, the potholes, even as we negotiate parking around BIC, even that is there. So the morphology of the city is constantly being overlaid with the ecology and has been overlaid with the human. So how would you, in the book, how has this been addressed, or if it has not been addressed, what are the lacuna that you would, what are the things that you would like to write about which you didn't write about in the book?
I'm really looking forward to reading the book because I'm a new resident of Bangalore, having moved from Bombay, which has undergone something very similar. But in terms of, you were talking about how the solution seemed to be like there's a gap between what is happening and the forces that are determining what is happening. So, for instance, there seems to be a conjunction between politicians and global capital, and all our cities seem to be part of a global circuit, serving a global circuit of finance and capital. So, is the solution a more intercity, because it's happening to many cities?
Okay.
So,
Hello. Firstly, I just wanted to say that this was an amazing event. Thank you so much for speaking everything that you did. My question is about the philanthropists and NGOs that work in the city right now. If you could comment about the role, the ideal role that they should be playing with the trajectory the city is heading. If you could just speak a little bit.
Thank you for this event. And my question is, how did the developments of 1990s change the ethnic and linguistic demography of Bengaluru?
Okay, so how should we take these questions? Would you like, any of you like to answer a question?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to everyone for coming. I wanted to clarify maybe to the second question a little bit. It is a kind of a conundrum that we face when we try to understand what's happening in cities like Bangalore or Bombay. Because we don't want to reduce everything to, okay, global capital is like this and therefore, right? I think what we have tried to do in our work is to lay out the various kinds of connections and linkages that are there without giving agency only to one kind of thing. Global capital is very important. And this is a debate I had with Michael many times. Many of you may not even know that Blackstone, which is the Wall Street private equity firm, is the biggest owner of commercial real estate in India. And owner and manager, right? Office space. Those things are important, but what we look at are the kinds of much more city level and local level connections to which everybody gets involved in these modes of accumulation. So, private equity doesn't just come into a real estate project, it comes in partnership with a company like Embassy or Prestige to create a project. And within that, then there are the local land aggregators, the brokers, and all kinds of people who have to be there simply to assemble land for a big project that needs 100 acres. And those are the dynamics that we're very interested in. And then going back to what Janaki said, here is where the politicians come in, because it is very true that most of them are also making money at that kind of a level. So it's not very hard to understand why expertise in the city is being ignored. We have many people, including IIC campus, urban transport department, whatever they're called, have done many studies to show that the more you create things like flyovers, and tunnel roads, etc., the more you're going to foster privatized transport. And yet, everyone else's interest is on the other side. It is big mega projects where the money is, right? And I think we all know that.
Yeah, but
I
I
think
just want to add to that, Carol, saying that in response to the second question in particular, that the fact that global capital is shaping certain city spaces is absolutely correct. Of course, sometimes in league with local capital, but that's not the only thing that is shaping the city. And that when Shivakumar answered Kiran Mazumdar in this recent exchange, he reminded her that we live in a democracy, and that was not an accidental reminder. It is precisely because of our politicians and because of our electoral system that the poor have even the rights to be relocated, as the one example was given of the relocation away from this Karmikara colony to some other space. I have looked at the relocation from the center, which was actually Vidhan Saudha, to Tilak Nagar, and what happened to that space. That relocation, negotiating the relocation, and so on, all these are political processes which happen in our democracy. So it's not as if the local is actually completely absent when these forces are actually. So it's also a question of how much you can, deploy the law, how much you can actually get support from politicians who will eventually perhaps give you some sort of space within the city. It's not true that they completely have to ignore you and carry on, bulldozing the entire place. Sorry.
Right. I think, as Carol pointed out, and very nicely written in her chapter, and these small aggregators, etc., work along caste politics too. The other thing I just wanted to say is, why are we exempting ourselves? We are also part of the aspiration of. We have aspirations to live in a city like this. We are part of. So it's not something from the top. It is something that we're all part of.
Yeah, I wanted to say that it opens up a lot of debate in the current climate with the new GBA coming in. And it also draws focus, the lived experiences of all the various stories that you gather here will just again bring us back to what the law says. So I can very clearly say that the city is growing in a very unconstitutional way. So hopefully now at least, we will focus on the 12th schedule, which has some 18 different points. And given that BBMP has been doing some dance drama on climate change and the climate change plan and things like that, it's like a side event, just go through it and see how much of it even aligns with the 12th schedule. There's nothing. It's just one side event, So every one of the stories here, the essays here, somewhere will bring you back to the provisions of the 12th schedule, which has 18 points from urban planning to burial grounds to everything. And to address your question on the role of philanthropies and foundations, while Bangalore is home to a whole lot of philanthropies and foundations, ESD is a 25 plus year old organization. It did not receive funding from any of the philanthropies either here or across India, because most of them look at a 3 years funding cycle where they want, results, they want behavior change, they want results like in 3 years. To shut down the landfill, we started working in 2003 and we managed to shut down the landfill only in 2012. And that case is still going on. It is in the High Court of Karnataka. We are hoping that, the landfill impacted community will get some compensation, so on and so forth. The lake case, for instance, was filed in 2008. Yes, a final judgment came in 2012, but we had to implead again. And that case is still going on, looking at all the encroachments in the city, of the lakes in the city. And so no foundation of philanthropy would want to fund something like that where they are not sure of a result within 3 years. I hope that explains. Thank you.
Swati, I think you should answer the 1990s shifts in ethnicities in the city. I think you're the ideal person to answer.
Actually, I wanted to answer Meera's question about what are some things.
Okay, well, that as well.
Yeah. So I think 3 things come to mind. One, I think the next book on Bangalore should be an environmental history of Bangalore, environment, ecology, and given the increasing salience of climate change, I do think that if we are writing histories of the present, then looking at environment is something much more closely is important. And I think the book only partially touches on that. And the second thing that I also wanted to talk, I think the book opened up for me is to think about social movements in terms of its urban origins. So much of this 1990s, 2000s, and some of you have all been involved. We have people here who've been involved in looking at activism in the urban, and the urban has been the site of action. And many who are not here, who've been part of this book, have gone on to taken their activism to the state level, where they're looking at communalism, where they're looking at labor, etc. And all of that began, for instance, with protesting against the cutting of trees, or protesting against the privatization of lakes. So activism in Bangalore or in the state, there's a the urban has been a site of action for many activists and the activist movements in the state. So I think that's a maybe a historical approach is needed to look at the urban in with regard to resistance that Bangalore has engendered. Um, and the third, I think, perhaps because of my own interest in looking at Karnataka and state formation, I think it may be much more useful to also locate Bangalore within Karnataka. Yes, there is arguments to be made that the city is now delinked from the hinterland, um, but that I'm not entirely convinced that that's true, given that we have people coming in from people, resources being drawn from the hinterland. So locating Bangalore within this more, less, I suppose, fancy thing called the Karnataka state, maybe something that we need to look at. And to, yeah, so those are three things that I think we could perhaps think of as future projects as well. I think the 1990s was the time of the great migration to Bangalore, particularly for working in the garment industry, working in the construction sector. So the city becomes a migrant destination in ways that it was not previously. So Janki's own work has looked at the category of Bangalore as a middle class city, but I think the 1990s mark a time when Bangalore becomes a site of labor. And it's in these ways that the city is also linked to the hinterland, continues to be linked to the hinterland. So this was the time when people were coming in from North Karnataka, but now we have people coming in from eastern and northeastern parts of India into the city. So this is a time when this is a time of changing composition of I suppose the laboring workforce in some. I don't know if you
Yeah,
want to
with
add
the
to that.
we cannot discuss this, but with very important consequences for the question of language, which we are. But we have to leave it there. I do urge you to go out and pick up the book if you wish, but definitely read it even if you don't buy it. And thank you to all the panelists for the extremely fascinating discussion of the book itself that has happened here today.